Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. I have been looking forward to this conversation about a terrific win for Granite State students, the Every Voice Bill. This is an exciting and important initiative to address sexual violence on our campuses, and I'm so honored to talk about it today with this group of advocates and champions. Students have been involved in every single step of this legislation, and I'm so deeply impressed by the leadership of Sophia Miller, a current student, and John Gabrielli, a recent graduate. They and their fellow students with the Every Voice Coalition are showing how important it is that young people lead this fight. We also have with us State Senator Martha Hennessy. As a member of the State House and State Senate for the last 6 years, Senator Hennessy has been a critical voice for the Upper Valley. She's a remarkable and talented legislator, as shown by the way she spearheaded this bill through the State House. And Pamela Keilig is Public Policy Specialist at the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. The coalition and their 13 member programs around the state take a holistic approach to addressing violence and supporting survivors. I can't say enough about the amazing work that Pamela and her colleagues do and how much we rely on this partnership with them. This topic is deeply personal for me. Both Senator Hennessy and I have opened up about our own experience with sexual violence and harassment when we were students in college some 40 years ago. So for us, it's especially heartbreaking to hear from students about how this outrageous conduct has remained so pervasive and yet is still the most underreported crime on our college campuses. Meanwhile, the Trump administration is taking this issue in the wrong direction. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos' new Title IX rule, which took effect in August of 2020, will chill reporting of campus sexual violence and sweep it even further under the rug. Secretary DeVos pushed this rule through without engaging with students and survivors of sexual violence, and while showing no consideration of the overwhelming opinion of public comments about the rule. The end result narrows the definition of sexual harassment, absolves schools of core responsibility, and subjects survivors to courtroom-style cross-examinations without giving a moment's thought about how this might re-traumatize them. The Trump administration is sending the message to young survivors of sexual violence that they won't be believed nor taken seriously. This policy is an absolute travesty, and with my colleagues, including our neighbor Ayanna Pressley in Massachusetts, I helped introduce legislation that will block the administration from implementing this rule change any further. My sincere hope is that we can get this rule reversed next year. I'm also working across the aisle with members of my bipartisan task force to end sexual violence to develop common sense legislation that protects our students. Earlier this year, I was proud to team up with my colleague Pete Stauber from Minnesota to introduce legislation that would help strengthen and streamline how schools report sexual violence and other crime data to the government, because we need accurate information in order to fully comprehend the scope of this problem. But while we have been fighting to protect students and stop the Title IX rule in Washington, it's wonderful to see that states are stepping up. And I am so proud of all of you on this call for your efforts to pass the Every Voice bill here in New Hampshire. This is a momentous achievement that makes the Granite State a national leader in combating campus sexual violence. And with that, let me turn it over to each of you for any initial remarks you'd like to make. So let's start with Sophia and John to talk about the roots of the Every Voice Coalition and how this bill came to be.
Congresswoman, and I'd like to begin first and foremost by thanking those who are joining us today, in particular, Senator Hennessy and the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. This is, for us as students and young alumni, as you said, a personal issue, one that comes out of deep pain from seeing our friends and loved ones and ourselves impacted by sexual violence and not be able to get justice for decades. And it's because we have leaders like Senator Hennessy and allies like the New Hampshire Coalition that have made New Hampshire a leader in combating sexual violence, have listened to students and survivors, and have made this all possible. This bill wouldn't exist without them, and we're very grateful for their partnership in this work. Where does this bill come from? It comes from students and survivors. It comes from those who are being impacted on campus. And what we believe at Every Voice is, if we're going to overcome a sexual violence epidemic has been decades in the making, it has to start by listening to those who are being impacted. And so students and survivors, it started with 8 of us together in a basement saying, we're seeing what's wrong on our campuses and we want to help be a part of the solution. And at this difficult, challenging moment, when, as you rightly pointed out, we have an administration under Secretary DeVos that is ignored students and survivors. In fact, we had requested to meet with them directly, and our response was never listened to. We said, it's time for us to take this into our own hands and push for protections at the state level. And so first and foremost, I just wanted to thank the coalition and Senator Hennessy, and to say this moment that's been years in the making is a victory for students and survivors all across New Hampshire. And the message is very clear that we hear you, we believe you, and that New Hampshire stands with survivors in combating this sexual violence epidemic.
Terrific. Sophia, you want to join in?
Yeah, thank you so much, Congresswoman. I'll just echo what John said. I think one thing that has always really stood out to me about this legislation and about Every Voice is kind of that emphasis on really putting survivors and students first. Kind of as we mentioned, this issue is specifically impacting college students. Like, we are the population that arguably knows the most about it because we have watched it happen. We've watched incidents of sexual violence affect our friends, our loved ones, even ourselves on campus. And so to hear that legislators are willing to kind of listen to us and to take these issues seriously and to realize that this is a problem and to elevate student and survivor voices is just so important. And I'm really hoping as well that kind of New Hampshire can serve as this model for other states. And I'm so grateful that people are taking the time to listen and to talk about this work that we've been doing so that we can kind of hopefully promote that in other states and make sure that other survivors and students are heard.
Great. Well, Senator Hennessy, do you want to share with us how the bill came together and how you built the coalition to get it passed in the New Hampshire State Legislature?
I'd be happy to, and I appreciate the thanks from John Gabrielli. I have to say that my feelings are that he had every bit as much, if not more, to do with this success than I. He came to me in sort of at the end of our filing period in the last year of the biennium, and 2 things came through my mind. One, oh my goodness, I'm not going to take any more bills. I'm too busy. I'm chairing judiciary. I can't do it. But very quickly, I believe, I turned to, however, this is really the reason I got into politics in the first place. I, as Annie pointed out, had my own horrendous experiences with assault on the college campus. And I have been working with students for a couple generations now about trying to make sure that colleges do the right thing. The good news is that in the past decade, I have to say, the colleges in New Hampshire have already started to listen, at least. And at the beginning, I felt they were not. Now I feel as if they truly are. We've made a lot of headway, but we obviously had farther to go. And I have to say that John's expertise and people like Sophia working so hard to help have not only made a huge difference for the students in New Hampshire, but they've also warmed my heart in a way I almost can't express. As someone who, as Annie and I have been going through this for 40 plus years, we both know how exciting it is to have the young people, today's college students and recent graduates, be at the forefront of this effort. And so we worked together. John and his Every Voice group really did an amazing job at talking to senators and House members from both sides of the aisle. And boy, were they successful. We were just beside ourselves with how much success we achieved in terms of voting. And it really is due to the tireless work of John Gabrielli and his team. I was lucky to take on this bill, and I have to say that it was a delightful way to be retiring from the Senate myself, because nothing meant more to me this year.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And thank you too for your service as well. So Pam Kyla, do you want to just weigh in here how this legislation about college campuses in New Hampshire fits in with the other work of the Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence in New Hampshire?
Yeah, thank you so much, Congresswoman. And, for this incredible opportunity to speak to the Every Voice bill and the importance of addressing sexual assault on college campuses. I want to, echo and lift up everything that everyone's already said. But we just really appreciate having the space and the collective commitment to supporting survivors of sexual assault in the Granite State. And this is really exciting and groundbreaking legislation that codifies those best practices in the field that Senator Hennessy mentioned many college campuses are already moving towards, and just really, again, enhancing New Hampshire's status as that national leader in preventing sexual assault. And I think for us in our role across the state as our 13 member programs and working to prevent and respond to sexual violence across the state, college campuses and survivors there are, of course, a huge part of the work we do. And we actually have one crisis center, SHARP, that is based on a college campus at UNH. And we work with our other community-based crisis centers to make sure that we're able to provide prevention education and support survivors in that capacity. And this legislation and new law that will start in January will really help move that momentum forward and really ensure transparency on college campuses so that responses across the board can be survivor-centered and really ensure that they are addressing the needs that need to be met.
So, John, back to you. Could you just describe a little bit for our listeners what was in the legislation and then how you anticipate spreading the good word of that when it becomes effective in January, how to get other campuses on board to the new legislation in New Hampshire?
Of course. Well, as you alluded to earlier, we're at a very difficult time right now. We just, not only are we in the midst of a pandemic, but we just saw the largest single rollback of survivors' rights, probably in history, but certainly in decades, take place with this federal new regulation that 19 states sued to stop the ACLU, the Victim Rights Law Center. Unfortunately, we're not able to win an injunction. And there's no other way to say it. I mean, students are in unprecedented danger right now. They will not have the types of protection from the federal government that they need under this administration. And so it was all the more critical for New Hampshire to step up and provide comprehensive protections at the state level. And what this legislation is designed to do is to codify common sense best practices to ensure that all survivors and all students, regardless of where they go to school, have basic protections. I'd point to probably 5 core components of the bill, though there are a lot of important things in there, but I think the 5 most important would be the first, data collection. Sexual violence is the most underreported of all violent crimes. The Every Voice bill will create a statewide anonymous campus climate survey so that students can safely make their voices heard, and so that we'll have the data that we need as policymakers, as students, parents, and families to help drive forward progress on sexual violence and make sure students' voices are heard. Second, MOUs in collaboration with rape crisis centers. And this is certainly speaking directly to the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. New Hampshire has excellent rape crisis centers that serve as centers of excellence in their community, provide services that survivors need. And this bill will establish MOUs between crisis centers and universities so students can get those services and not fall through the cracks. Confidential resource advising is a huge one. Many survivors don't come forward to report because they are worried that they will lose control of the situation and need someone they can talk to understand what their options are, whether it's legal options, access to healthcare and counseling services, academic accommodations. This bill creates the position of confidential resource advisor that every student will have someone they can go to understand their rights and options. An amnesty protection that prevents survivors from being punished. This is in the year 2020. If you come forward to report a case of sexual violence, the first question you should be asked is never, what were you drinking or what were you wearing, in terms of victim blaming that discourages so many from coming forward. And this bill will provide an amnesty protection that if you do report a case of sexual violence, you can't be punished. If, for example, if you were drinking at the time of an assault. And the final piece, as we look to the future, is prevention education. The data shows that high quality prevention, evidence-based prevention education can reduce the rate of sexual violence on our college campuses. There are many great prevention educators doing that work already across New Hampshire today, but this bill strengthens existing federal requirements so that not only is prevention education provided to new first-year students, but New Hampshire will provide prevention education to all students and staff across New Hampshire to reduce the prevalence rate of sexual violence. And I think in New Hampshire is really the first state in the country to pass the Every Voice legislation and to pass legislation this comprehensive. 29 states still have no laws on the books whatsoever regarding campus sexual violence. And we've already had conversations with not only students, but lawmakers in other states that are looking to say, how could we use this New Hampshire example to plug some of the gaps that we see in federal regulations and ensure that students are kept safe at this difficult time?
And what are some of the states that you've been talking with, and do you anticipate legislation at the state level in other parts of the country come January when those state legislatures reconvene?
We do. We absolutely do. Every Voice is supporting student and survivor advocates across 9 states. Last January, legislation alongside the New Hampshire legislation was filed in Connecticut, Illinois, Massachusetts, and Hawaii. And this summer, we worked with students and survivors from all over the country to help students figure out. I mean, many students don't feel connected or empowered to speak out in terms of advocacy and policymaking and legislation. And so helping students understand your voice matters. And I think New Hampshire, more than anything else, is a powerful example to say when students and survivors do speak out, they can drive change. And that's inspired students in Nevada, in New Mexico, in Illinois, and in Maine to file Every Voice legislation in January 2021 across 9 states. So we're very optimistic that this could be a model that will say to students, your voice does matter, and we can and should expect more and better in terms of preventing sexual violence on college campuses.
Sophia, do you want to weigh in with your experience as a student advocate and just how you go about organizing students and obviously the unique challenges of the pandemic, but how do you educate students about making their voice heard?
Yeah, definitely. I think that is obviously kind of a really interesting thing because I know, like, as a student, especially as a younger student during my freshman and sophomore year, I joined Every Voice actually at the beginning of my sophomore year. I think I wasn't really sure if there was kind of a concrete way that I could make change. I didn't know kind of the power of student advocacy. And I remember a lot of our initial work with Every Voice was just a small group of students. Our group kind of grew through word of mouth. I actually found out about Every Voice from a friend in a gender studies class. It was just like, hey, you should join this phone call with me. And that was kind of a lot of our original organizing work. And I remember one of our first kind of things that we did was reaching out to state legislators and trying to find a prime sponsor for the bill, which ended up being Senator Hennessy, and then later trying to find co-sponsors. And I remember even that was really scary. It's like, I can't just call my senator. It was it was kind of new territory for me. But I think having the experience of former students like John and kind of the Every Voice national team who had really started this all from scratch and had learned, if you reach out to friends, you reach out to established student groups, and you reach out to people like state legislators and make those calls and just kind of really advocate for what you think is important. There's a lot of power in that. And that experience has been really interesting for me to kind of realize the power of students and student organizing. And I think the fact that we were able to get this bill passed, especially after just filing it for the first time ever in New Hampshire this session, was really amazing and very gratifying.
So Senator Hennessy, could you talk about, as a legislator, how you deal with outside advocacy groups or individuals like students coming to Concord? How do you engage them in the process and help their voice be heard in what could be kind of an arcane process for most people?
Right. I would love to. And I'd like to just start by saying, as I listen to Sophia and certainly John, that I never cease to be amazed at the intelligence and articulate ways in which they have advocated for this bill and for the men and women in college today. So I'm so grateful to them. And I also, I think it is interesting. I personally, living on a college campus, I do give a lot of preference in my mind to students who are interested. There was this, and to high school students. One of my favorite bill from the year before was from a high school student in Rochester, New Hampshire, who pointed out to me that there were girls in Rochester who weren't coming to school because when they had their period, they couldn't afford the product. So we made sure that every middle and high school female and gender neutral bathroom in New Hampshire has free products. So, but that was a high school student who wrote me a letter after being at Girls State. Yeah, and I just, I must say they pique my interest more maybe than a lot of the other groups that come. It's not that I don't listen to the usual groups that come forward, but the student groups, I think in this very difficult time, the students, and particularly these two here, John being an alumnus, but have given me hope. I think this is our future, and these are the next generation of people who are going to be paying more attention and are taking risks by reaching out to senators in their state to say this is something that people need to be working on and thinking about. And it is astonishing to me, as I said, that it passed unanimously in the Senate, in the state Senate, and then yeah, unanimously. It was just extraordinary, and I attribute a lot of that to the positive message that John and his group brought to everybody in the Senate. It was, and again, the governor did not veto it. And with a governor who had vetoed 70 bills of late, it was really wonderful. And so I hope that they have learned an enormous amount about how to advocate, but it felt a little like they came in knowing how to advocate. So I really was able to just act as an advisor and say, here are some people you should really talk with. Here's some ways of addressing this issue, and keep me in the loop. Let me know how I can help. So it was definitely my favorite bills were the ones that came from students over my time in the legislature.
And Pam, how does the Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, how do you engage constituent groups, including excuse me, college students and high school students in the advocacy process when you're working in the State House?
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways that we engage, especially on the grassroots level. We loved working with the Every Voice Coalition and other partners in this movement to get this legislation at the forefront of conversations. And, we work directly with our crisis centers to reach out to their community members. We have survivor networks that we engage with, to write letters to their representatives or make a phone call to the governor's office. So there's a lot of different ways. And I think SHARP at UNH does a great job, especially in engaging their students in that direct advocacy as well. And we definitely try to put forth survivor-centered legislation and pieces of, bring forth laws that are in the moment really necessary and needed and are part of the conversation of how we can move protections for survivors forward. So that's just sort of a preview of how we do that.
John, are there Every Voice coalitions on the college campuses? Which campuses in New Hampshire have the Every Voice group? And then how are you growing your coalition?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman. It's been you know, one day at a time. Like I said, when we started out, it was 6 or 7 of us together in a basement, just thinking, we see what's wrong on our campuses and we want things to be different. We didn't know, and I started out as a sophomore myself. We didn't really know a lot about how the political process works with legislation. We didn't understand the difference between the committees versus the House, the Senate, bills being passed to be engrossed, enacted, Ways and Means. I mean, there are all these systems that oftentimes students feel like they're outsiders looking in, and we kind of had to figure a lot of things out by trial and error, and just with our amazing partners to help coach and guide us and advise us as we worked through it. And one thing that we found is the more that we talked to students, we realized students are having these same challenges and feel just as impacted on every campus. They just don't necessarily know what to do about it, or how to make their voices heard. And when we reached out and said, hey, we want to advocate together, students right away, they either knew someone who had been impacted, they had been impacted, and wanted to be involved. And so it started informally, and with students here at Dartmouth and UNH and Keene State and Plymouth and all over New Hampshire, SNHU and elsewhere, public and private universities and community colleges, state universities, and just coming together to say, you're not alone. There are many students on other campuses facing these same challenges. And if we unite our voices as one, we can have that much more of an impact. So it sort of grew pretty organically. And as Sophia mentioned, things came together really quickly here in New Hampshire. We found the legislature to be incredibly receptive, thanks to the leadership of Senator Hennessy and many others. And I can't tell you how much it means after 6 years of advocacy to see those protections written into law, and to know that for generations to come, I mean, nobody thinks that we don't need better data on sexual violence. Nobody thinks that students and survivors should have to live in the same dining hall, or eat in the same dining hall, or live in the same dorm as the person who assaulted them. And now, thanks to this legislation, that won't be the case because of student advocacy. So I think to see that passage all the way through from sitting down and saying, hey, there's a problem here, all the way to legislation that's been enacted, and now working with the coalition and others to actually implement that legislation, has been incredibly empowering, especially because sexual violence oftentimes is a crime of power, where power is taken away, and where for decades, students and survivors have been silenced and ignored, and there's been a shame and a stigma around people speaking out. And to realize that this is an opportunity for students and survivors to reclaim that power, to use those experiences to drive change. It's been really transformative, at least for me, and I think for many others too.
Well, one of the things I'd love to offer, we have a very strong relationship with the New Hampshire College and University Council, that is a coalition, almost a trade association, if you will, for higher education here in New Hampshire, with the public university system, the private colleges, the community colleges. And we'd love to help create a relationship for you that heading into January, when this law will go into effect, to have a positive response from those administrators around the state. Sophia, back to you again with COVID-19. What's different about the organization? And John, feel free to weigh in, but what's different about organizing students to have a voice and to advocate pre-COVID, post-COVID? I'm curious, in some ways, one of the challenges that we've always faced in New Hampshire is that the campuses feel a long way apart from each other. They're not very far, it's an hour or two, but everybody's in their own little bubble. Have you been able to sort of break down that barriers through Zoom or meeting together across the state? And is there any kind of a silver lining, I guess I'd ask, in terms of organizing to communicate with your colleagues on all other campuses?
Yeah, I think so. I think, obviously the pandemic has presented a lot of challenges overall. But one of the things that it did allow us to do was have these Zoom calls with kind of our core group of organizers in New Hampshire, our steering committee, and then students from other schools. And those were calls that to be honest, we would have had to do probably over the phone anyways. So having this kind of like Zoom norm be in place just kind of facilitated that, because as you mentioned, you know, a lot of the time, like the people doing this work are students. And when you have students in UNH, you have students at Hanover, at Dartmouth, that's like a pretty significant drive. And we can't be making that necessarily every week. So having those meetings be virtual is actually kind of a lot of help. As you kind of alluded to, I think it does, in our experience, make it a little bit easier to connect students who normally are kind of on these separate levels, and maybe aren't necessarily able to go to these big state meetings really far from where their school is at any point. Um, I will say, you know, definitely one thing that was challenging was with the pandemic, the legislative session in New Hampshire
Yes,
got pushed back. Yes.
that was
Um,
very challenging for everyone.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and it ended up, oh, sorry. It ended up posing like a particular challenge because by the time the bill was actually being considered, most schools were letting out. So colleges had finished their terms. And so a lot of students, you know, had finished finals and people weren't checking organizational emails anymore. Students might not be checking their own emails. So it put us in a strange place. We were like, wow, this is great. We have our kind of final push for the bill, and it didn't line up with the school schedule.
Yep, yep. Which is always one of the challenges, right, in terms of students being involved in advocacy. Well, we have a few more minutes, and I guess I'd just love to open it up to anyone about ideas going forward. I'll say for myself, obviously a big election right around the corner. And without getting overly political, I certainly hope that we will have someone in Joe Biden and Kamala Harris that will be much more attentive. Joe Biden, of course, one of the original founders of the Violence Against Women Act, and Kamala Harris, equally a leader in the Senate. So I'm hoping we will be able to roll back, if you will, the DeVos rule and get back on track toward violence prevention on campus and a more survivor-oriented, survivor-centric approach. But what are some of the thoughts that you have as we head into 2021 for advocacy on behalf of students, either at the state or the federal level?
Well, I'd say first, you know, we're looking forward to that rollback because hopefully those regulations are in place for a very short period of time. They're tremendously damaging, and students have been very clear about that. So thank you for your leadership, Congressman Kuster, on that subject. I mean, our fundamental view and our belief at Every Voice is that students and survivors need to be at the table, need to be in the conversation and driving the agenda on stopping campus sexual violence. And a lot of great work has been done by many folks on this subject. But oftentimes you find when we started our advocacy that students weren't necessarily in the room or in the conversation where a lot of key decisions were being made. And so our job is to try to elevate that voice and make sure that those who are being impacted are able to directly influence how policy is being shaped and provide feedback. Because while some policies may look good on paper, it might look different on your campus and how in terms of what's actually accessible to students. And so we think that's a critical thing to happen. At the same time, what we struggle with is, you know, we're an all volunteer student and survivor organization. We've tried to keep, so I got involved myself and my co-founders as an undergraduate. And one trend that we noticed was that there'd be a wave of student advocacy. And then 3 or 4 years later, all the progress would get lost because the students would graduate and, you know, it would be starting over from scratch. So we've continued that work post-graduation. I quit my job in February to see this through because it just means that much to us and to me and to my co-founders and on a personal level. But we're seeking a way to make this work more sustainable and to be able to continue this Every Voice work long-term in New Hampshire as well as across the country. So, you know, we're working on ways to raise funds and support students because one thing that we see is our greatest strength is being an all volunteer advocacy group. It's also a big weakness because it's hard to be able to stay, make it sustainable on top of jobs and school. And quite frankly, it limits the voices of who can be involved. Because when you look
Yes.
at who's disproportionately impacted by sexual violence, it is students of color, first generation students, LGBTQ students, and many students, low-income students, and those students oftentimes are excluded from conversations around sexual violence, where there's an assumption that a survivor looks a certain way, that it's a cisgendered white woman are victims of sexual violence, and not that women are disproportionately victims of sexual violence, but we need voices at the table from all communities, and that's why we're committed to a more inclusive approach and being able to provide stipends and financial enablement so students from all backgrounds can participate. So that's one big goal for us. As proud as we are of our advocacy, we want it to be better and more inclusive and involve students from all backgrounds. And then second of all, Congresswoman, I hope we can work together and reach out to your colleagues in other states, because there still are 29 states across the country that have no protections, including states that you'd expect otherwise. Even Massachusetts, just to the south, where we've been working for a number of years, still has no laws in place, but all across the country. And we want to continue to push the ball forward in that direction too. So eager to collaborate any way we can.
Well, and one way to do that might be to have a good relationship through the New Hampshire College and University Council to get those schools on board to these changes, so that there's not resistance to this legislation in other states. So anyone want to add anything else? Pam, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think, everything that John said, absolutely. And I think just also making sure that we're continued to be grounded in this moment where we're still in a pandemic, and recognizing that oftentimes survivor resources get put to the back burner in the midst of trying to establish other operations. And that was something we definitely saw initially at the start of the pandemic. There were no protocols or guidelines for how campuses should respond to sexual assault when everyone moved remote and left campus, and how do we make sure those cases are still being addressed. And I think having something like the Every Voice bill allows for that groundwork and making sure those considerations are forefront in this discussion. But I think there's still a lot of gaps in terms of making sure that funding is prioritized for resource advisors and advocates on campuses, and really making sure that survivors are able to get what they need, especially now when a lot of issues have been exacerbated because of the pandemic and financial loss and everything that everyone is experiencing in those intersections. So just really making sure that people continue to have access and are thought of in these processes.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I very much appreciate you all being with us, and we'll get a chance to put this up online and so that people can respond, and we'll look forward to working with you in the weeks and months ahead. And congratulations, all of you. Really extraordinary progress. It makes me very proud of New Hampshire that once again, we're on the cutting edge, and this is such important work that you've done. Good luck.
Thank you for all you've done, Annie. We really appreciate it.
Great, good. Thank you so much. Good luck. Stay safe. Be well. Take good care.
Bye all. Good to see you.
Bye all.